Even before the pandemic, so many of us took interest and pleasure in being armchair travelers. Getting out in the world while remaining in the comfort of home could mean enjoying a good book, which could transport us to a new reality. A movie or a video could bring us to places far away and engage us in things we will never actually have the opportunity to do, like trekking in Nepal, or sailing the Nile, snorkeling the Great Barrier Reef, ice fishing in the Arctic. Name the place or activity, and as armchair travelers, we'll likely have some familiarity with a world beyond our own, without a hint of danger or inconvenience. And still, there are some who dismiss risks for the sake of adventure. While the terrible saga of the Titan submersible was unfolding last week, I heard another adventure story which made me sit up and listen. Consider Kirstie Ennis, a retired Marine Corps sergeant who lost her leg in a helicopter accident. As she recuperated, she said that she needed a new challenge, so she focused on climbing the highest peaks in the world. With 6 of the 7 checked off her list, when Ennis climbed Mount Everest in 2019, she was forced to turn back because her team ran low on oxygen. So disappointing. But that's not why I paused when I heard her story. Just last week, after 43 days of climbing, which had followed months of preparation, and that failed first attempt, Ennis stood on that same mountain 200 meters from the summit. And that's when she made the decision to turn back. 200 meters from her goal. Here's what she was thinking. To be totally honest, she said, I was heartbroken. I was devastated and heartbroken because I poured my heart into all of this. I had worked so hard. I climbed all around the world. I had gone through all sorts of different lessons, like certifications, qualifications, and I never really felt comfortable being called a mountaineer. I feel like that is such a prestigious title because it's something that so many people work their buns off for. And so this time around, I was slightly embarrassed that I had to turn around. But at the same time, I am very, very proud of the fact that I made that decision because there were a lot of other people climbing that night who got hurt. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if anyone on my team had gotten hurt. And with the Titan tragedy in the background, I have renewed respect for Kirstie Ennis's judgment. Despite her personal disappointment, she did what she thought was best for the sake of all. Mary Louise Kelly, who interviewed Ennis, noted, knowing your limits is a victory in itself. These are 2 very different adventure stories that straddle the delicate line that danger poses between responsibility and blame. When explorers return home safely, they are lauded. And should they meet with tragedy, endless variations of what could have been done differently revolve in our heads. If only we think, grasping for a reason, hoping for a different outcome, some way to make sense of the failure. When the Titan voyage went from a rescue to a recovery effort, that kind of thinking was woven through much of the public commentary. Inevitably, what comes along with a failed adventure narrative is blame. These current events made me read our Torah portion, Hukat, a bit differently this week. We all know that God's chosen servant, Moses, another mountain climber, is also the lead guide in the trek to the Promised Land, with Miriam and Aaron completing the team, and God acting as their spiritual and ultimate GPS. What I didn't expect, however, was how the biblical commentators would come to sound so similar to the many current voices and pundits, like those who assigned blame to the failed Titan explorer. You see, this portion, Hukat, is also known by commentators as the sin of Moses. So even someone who's entirely new to the text might approach it with a negative impression. And yet there is nothing that specifies what was lacking and why Moses is cast in this terrible light. Those voices are added by subsequent generations only in retrospect. The JPS Torah commentary calls this the Gordian knot of the Bible. So let's unpack this just a bit to see where it takes us. I'm sure you're familiar with the story. Miriam has died, and the miraculous well of water that accompanied her through their desert wanderings no longer appears. And so naturally, the Israelites complain not only about their thirst, but about desert life in general. Why did you bring us here, they ask Moses. Why did we ever agree to leave Egypt, which had everything we needed, grain and figs and pomegranates, and now there isn't even water to drink? So when similar circumstances occurred way back in the book of Exodus, God told Moses to gather the people, and before their very eyes to take his staff and to strike a certain rock from which water would then flow. For both Moses and the Israelites, because so much had been brought about by using that same staff, it became apparent that the rod itself was associated with God's miracles, chief among them the 10 plagues. With the rod, the Nile's waters turned into blood, and dust later became lice. With that same staff, Moses brought frogs up into the land and created a wind to blow the locusts throughout Egypt. That rod symbolized an extension of God's power while demonstrating God's providence and God's care. Now, some 38 years later, when the Israelites complain again, Moses checks in with God and receives virtually the same instructions. You and Aaron take the rod and assemble the community, and before their very eyes, order the rock to yield its water. If you didn't catch the nuance here, I want to assure you that neither did Moses. God said, order the rock to give water. And even though Moses was to take the rod, unlike every other occasion when he was told to take it, here he was not to use it. But he did, not once, but twice. Moses hit that rock not once, but twice, instead of using his words to invoke God's power. We readers only know that God was displeased after the fact, when the text admonishes Moses with these words, "Because you didn't trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelites, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land I have given them." No matter how many times I read this, I find it incredible. Moses is barred from accompanying the Israelites into the promised land from his version of Everest or the Titanic. How is it possible that a lifetime of sacrifice is wiped away? And though that question will never be answered to our satisfaction, here is where the commentators seem to pile on, citing every possible flaw as a reason for his punishment. Rabbi Shmuel David Luzzatto observed, Moses committed one sin, yet the commentators have accused him of 13 or more, each inventing some new iniquity. How easy it is to blame, even to blame Moses. But Rabbi Jonathan Sacks calls our attention to a parallel story which is deeply personal and obscured by his duty to the Israelites. To quote Rabbi Sacks, Moses at the rock was not so much a prophet as a man who had just lost his sister. He may have been the greatest of all prophets, but he was also human, rarely more so than here. When bereaved, he explains, you lose control of your emotions. You find yourself angry when the situation calls for calm. You hit when you should speak. You speak when you should be silent. And even when God has told you what to do, you're only half listening. You hear the words, but they do not fully enter your mind. Moses at the rock. Rather than blame, this portion calls out for compassion. While we might join the generations who lament Moses' misstep, we can also easily understand how grief interfered with his judgment and his responsibilities. Doesn't he deserve that kindness? Our greatest prophet weathered his deepest disappointment, and yet he still shouldered his future responsibilities without bitterness, without blaming others. In our own lives, which are likely filled with a lot less drama and fewer life-changing events, may we too find room to offer others more compassion and less blame. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be so.